So then, we are back with the more understandings from the Renewed Covenant, from the Aramaic English translation of the Word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of Israel, from the prophets of Yahweh many centuries ago, giving us then the indication of the time of the end and what we should do. Based upon those holy prophecies, we find ourselves during the time of restoration and the reduction of time from 2031. So then we begin our quest in finding out why there are so many conflicts around the world and the many political unrests in many nations. And obviously we find then the time of a transition reaching its peak, because the city must be built, and we are during the time truly of the Yeshayahu 1:8, where the prophecy states, then tabernacling amongst the fears in the land of Cush, beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. We already found in 61st chapter then the cities being laid waste for so many centuries. They are returning, and then later the holy city must be refurbished, and also the temple rebuilt. Lots of events yet coming, but we have found ourselves during the very infancy times, where the nations yet fighting against each other, until the proper time of then understanding the prophecies, and then the people of Yahweh going out and teaching the others. That's where then the most problematic can become, because people must be informed of these holy prophecies, as then Yahweh himself, he said during the time that he was in charge of the temple, Jerusalem was a nation of directives, directing the nations in the ways of Yahweh. But when Yahweh came then as Yeshua, then he couldn't find the city the way it should be. So a whole situation had generated from the first service and the second service, where then they decided to maintain allegiance to the first service. So then we find ourselves during this time where the very factor where they decided to take sides of the first tabernacle services, then the second tabernacle services were neglected for some time, and then we find in Yohanan in the first holy city, and then we find in 1009 when the cities were destroyed, and then 1,000 years of the reign of Nahashatan, and ended in 0809. 08 because the end of the year of 08 finished then the covenant of death set in 01, 2001, and then by violence the time of the covenant of death then ended. So then we understand also that there is the pagan calendars. They are not lined up with 2009 ending. It's because of the time of Yohanan spent in the holy city. It's very evident. Because the time, prophetic time related with the holy cities started when the gates had closed. Evaluate, for instance, what Shaliach Shaul was explaining in Hebrews, the 11th chapter. He's always pointing to the holy city. The reference point during the time of the second tabernacle services always indicates yet the city to come from heaven when the earth is renewed, much in the future. So then the rest of the first layer of understanding of the holy cities obviously starts with the holy city in a desert, secluded. Then came the holy city set by his son. And then we find then the Shilishim teaching then the people from his ascension until the time of Yohanan, the time of a transition. And it was very tough time of transition. Yahweh the Messiah had a huge problem with the time, because they cling to those areas where then those were past. So then we are during the time of a restoration, where we have to find ourselves in a dual situation. The first is then encouraging the people staying behind in the first tabernacle services, and then encouraging them to return to the second tabernacle services, and then forming the first holy city. It's not a very easy task. The Messiah Yahweh had his hard times, and then the Shilishim had a hard time, Shaliach Shaul had a hard time, Shimon had a hard time. Then Yohanan, we have the record that he was in the holy city and he ended up in prison later. But then we found ourselves during his time with the city then built up, and then other cities went in construction after. So then during this time of restoration, as people they think it's so minute, heaven's understanding is the most important. And until we begin to line up our schedules with the Creator's calendar, it's going to take some time. That's why then Yahweh has decided to have a holy city far away from the Holy Land for some time. Because transitional times always targets those most important areas where the focus were at in the past, obviously. So any person in charge of war, such as Yahweh, he is Yahweh Gibor, Yahweh of war, he understands this factor. Because he is the best war planning person. And he decided to have his holy city built where then there is war, but there is also the distance from then the main conflict area. So then after the city is built, and then as per the instructions of Moses, because then we begin our quest with the instructions from the Torah, and then we come through the ages then with the Messiah coming, explaining then the updates for the second services, and then we find ourselves during the time where then the city in the land of Cush must be put together, so then later, shortly later, then would have harmony in the world for a time. So when we read the prophecy of Yeshiach, we find even the heathen would observe his mighty works, and they would be glad. And then the Gentiles serving the holy city, obviously around the city in the service area. That's why when you read, then the stranger would then take care of your vineyards, and then the stranger would then take care of your flocks. He's explaining when the first city would be then constructed. Later other cities would come, and then they would resume the holy services. While in the spirit in the Holy of Holies, then they would understand. Even the Gentiles would then tend to their flocks, tend to their vineyards, and taking care of the holy cities. But until then, we must take a risk. We must put together an expedition very fast and finding the holy site. Might take a couple days, might take months. But then as Yahweh had said to his combat people that they should go over there in a land of the strange prior of conquering the promised land, and there was giants, big giants. Netherlands, they were very big and they were scared, but they had to take a risk because Yahweh had said you have to go there and conquer the land. So during these times of huge wars and rumors of wars and earthquake, pestilences, as the Messiah said, yet we must be obedient to the prophecies of Yahweh, because they were explaining areas where in the future would be extremely relevant, and they're related directly with the reconstruction of the temple. Because the main driver of finding the holy site is the direct link with the reconstruction of the holy temple in Jerusalem. Yahweh does not do these situations if it does not have a direct link with the harmony in the Holy Land, obviously. He's extremely smart. He was the best, he is the best, and he shall be the best. But then it's up to us, making sure we understand the holy prophecy, and then at least put together an expedition. It doesn't cost very much. And then find a holy site. From then on, there are so many Gentiles saved in the Messiah, and they want to do it. But the site must be found first. We must do our utmost to shift our minds from the war in the Middle East, from the war in the land of Israel, because Yahweh knew during the time of a transition it would cause conflicts. Of course, during the time of the Messiah, he had many conflicts. Even the authorities around him were persecuting himself and also his people. So Yahweh understands this point. However, we must be courageous and put together an expedition and find a holy site. Because the holy site, when the city is constructed, is directed, linked with the reconstruction of the temple. And not only the first city, but then the second city, the third city, the fourth city, until a number of cities are so numbered where then the second anointing comes, and then shortly after, as per Yahweh's direction, comes the reconstruction of the temple. Because the war over there with Israel and God is going to take some time. So then Yahweh is indicating from indirect sources, while then the nation of Israel is busy taking care of their conditions, then the holy city in the land of Cush must be put together very quickly. So then we begin to understand what Yahshua was explaining many centuries ago. So then we must be courageous and do what we said to do. The Messiah, when he was explaining, he was then in charge and giving them the directives from the oracles, and he then explained from Aleph to Taw every detail of the holy instructions. Also the shadow prophetic events, and then the representation of each of those areas when the prophets were explaining then in symbols or then in analogies. Those were also explained. During the time of the Messiah, it was an extremely important time because they did understand 100% the entire mystery of the Torah. So then in our time, for us to revive this huge knowledge that the Messiah has given us, then we must be obedient of what then the prophet told us to do. In spite of the entire war, what's going on, and the dangers of Africa, an expedition must be put together and then finding a holy site. Because absolutely true and certain and absolutely purely holy would be then the reaction of Ruach HaKodesh directing the finding of this holy site. Because we are dealing with the second tabernacle services and not the first tabernacle services. We have the most understandings of the first tabernacle services in the Holy Land, in Israel. But we are speaking of the second tabernacle services. So then later then the temple is going to be rebuilt. But it depends upon those holy sites being found and then cities constructed. And as we go, as we walk in the path of Yahweh and we are obedient, then He reveals the rest of it. But not until we take the first step. An expedition over there is very cheap. It's inexpensive. It's very inexpensive. Considering then the many benefits coming from, extremely cheap. But then we must shift our focus, yet during the time of this conflict they must have the 100% of their focus in what to do during the time of conflict, yet in the back of our minds. We must have then the exit or the escape of understanding the second tabernacle services and what the prophets are speaking with us regarding it. Because the plans of Yahweh, if you study very, very, very cautiously, you find Yahweh then always giving detours from the main focus of the problem. He is the best war expert. We find David, we find then sometimes Daniel involved with many of these areas. We find Ezekiel, Yirmiyahu. And our time is wisely doing the work that must be done in the Holy Land as they are doing the work. Yet in the back of our minds we understand there is a prophecy that must be completed. And it's very inexpensive going to the land of Cush and finding then the holy site. Very important. Please stay tuned. Much more, many more details coming up.